Hello! Another Steam Deck Roulette, another set of games to try and get working on this thing. I decided to try Just Cause this time around, partly because it's a series that I quite liked the first couple of games, and they are routinely quite cheap on Steam, and also because I haven't really played much of the kind of later games in the series. I kind of came into this series from the first game, and I remember playing the Just Cause 1, some sort of PC demo back in 2006, 2007, and kind of enjoying it quite a lot. So we're going to start with the first game. Came out in 2006, and it was released for a number of different platforms. So we're going to take a look at a couple of those, partly because it's kind of an interesting difference between the games. Starting with the PC version, was based on, I believe, the Xbox version. So this came out for PC, PS2, Xbox, and Xbox 360. Came out just before the PS3, so there was never a PS3 version. And it came out during that era of console games being ported to PC, where they just did not have controller support natively. So the first thing we've got to do is kind of set out a layout that will map the keyboard to the controller, which I always think is not an ideal solution. Some games you can get away with it, particularly older 2D games or games with very simplistic controls. I think when you get to something like Just Cause, you're probably struggling to replicate it. And one of the biggest problems is that because it doesn't support a game controller, it doesn't have prompts for it either. So even though we've mapped the buttons in the Steam input management console, you're still going to see press enter or press E, and then you've then got to mentally kind of do the gymnastics to remember that, oh, pressing X on the controller will make sure that it's, you're pressing E on the keyboard. If you're planning to play this on a Steam Deck without a keyboard and mouse, that is something to bear in mind. I do wonder whether there is a mod available for that sort of thing. I didn't get a chance to look, to be honest. But that would be again, something that I think would be useful. Outside of that though, the default kind of option for Just Cause, it doesn't give you a lot of graphical options, and one of the main reasons that this becomes a problem is that it, by default, only really supports 4:3 or 5:4 resolutions. So you're looking at 1024 by 768 or 1280 by 1024, I think, which isn't conducive to a 1610 display, but we will get there. We can fix that. Yeah, you get some options, and you'll probably be unsurprised to hear that you're not going to be taxing the Steam Deck running this game at max settings. You can probably see from the GPU and CPU utilization, it's pretty minimal, and it's using barely any wattage, so kudos for being able to play this with plenty of battery life if you're playing it not plugged in. But also graphically, it doesn't look great. So it's pretty aliased. I mean, it runs nicely, so it runs at 60 frames, but it doesn't look great. And I think the combination of not looking great, and also because you've mapped mouse and keyboard to a controller, the controls feel a little bit loose. And that's something that you probably could tweak and get to a comfortable position with it, but it's not an ideal. That it will depend entirely on how much tinkering you want to do with controls. I kind of like tinkering with these things from get them working. I don't love playing parts of games and then, tweaking the sensitivity and then trying it again, and that's not for me. I mentioned that we'd be able to fix the resolution, and that is where a very nice fix called Just Cause Widescreen Fix comes into place, built by 13AG. You can find it linked on the PC Gaming Wiki. But that is super useful for being able to set kind of arbitrary resolutions. There are also notes, and I guess it's something to be wary of, is that the website gives you kind of a download button and gives you some basic instructions. What it doesn't tell you on the website, and probably because this was built a long time ago, and not not built for the kind of invention of Proton and Steam Deck and those sorts of things. There's a slight addition that you need to do. So you need to go in and add a custom command into the Just Cause launch options. Once you've done that, you then can start playing around with the resolution. So the one thing to mention is that I thought as part of this, I would also look at what docked play would look like. So as we saw with Just Cause at 1024 by 768, it was barely touching any sort of threshold of the machine. So I set the resolution of this to 1920 by 1080. It would work perfectly fine with 1280 by 800 to fit the actual Steam Deck screen, but if we're going in and playing with custom resolutions, I thought it'd be worth trying it at 1080 and seeing what that looked like. And after some troubleshooting, as I mentioned, with the custom commands that you need, I got it working, and it looks considerably better, that's for sure. It's using a lot more resources at this point, but it's still relatively not taxing in particular. So again, in terms of battery life, not that you'd be, I guess, you'd have to be a very specific player if you're playing on battery with a docked display. I suppose if you have one of those Deck HD screens that you can kind of run at kind of 1080p resolution, maybe that's a thing. But yeah, it runs just fine. I think the big problem with this PC port is that it doesn't have all of the features that the 360 version has, and it doesn't have kind of the ease of use with controller that you'd expect out of a console version of the game. Which is then where I flipped over to trying the PS2 version. I ummed and ahed about whether to try the PS2 or the Xbox version. The Xbox version will be better. I can pretty much guarantee that. But Xbox emulation is still relatively, I guess relative. I don't want to say primitive because it's actually come on a long way, but compared to PlayStation 2 emulation, which has been around for over a decade, it's still in its infancy. So I picked the PlayStation 2 version, which might have been a mistake because as you get into the game, you can kind of see that we've got some rendering bugs, which is not ideal. There are ways around those to kind of make it render a little bit better, but it doesn't, even with it rendering properly, it doesn't look great. The problem with the PS2 version is that it's very much kind of stuck in that era. It's not a great version of the game. I guess when you were playing on a PS2, you didn't have a lot of choice in terms of that kind of fidelity of game. So the compromises they will have had to make made a bit more sense. But in this day and age, I think playing the PS2 version, there's no native widescreen support. You can upscale it in PCSX2, but again, like, it doesn't look great. And all in all, I think, yes, you get the ease of use because it's built for a controller already. I don't think it justifies switching to the PS2 version over the PC version because it looks archaic, and the PC version runs a lot better than it does. So I kind of think the PS2 version is a bit of a skip. The next one, though, I think is much more interesting, and that was I decided to try the Xbox 360 version. So you can enable Xenia support in EmuDeck, and that will allow it to emulate Xbox 360. So generally with this era of games, the PS3 360 era, you are almost certainly better off trying the PS3 version, if there is one. Because, again, similar to the PS2 Xbox mention, your chances of it working are a lot higher because RPCS 3 is much more mature. But the hardware requirements for RPCS 3 are very high. In this case, we didn't even have the option of a PS3 version. So I decided to see what the 360 version would look like, and part of the reason that I picked this one is that it's going to have native widescreen support. It has graphical features that other versions of the game, including the PC version, didn't have, which was kind of a weird... Again, it was a weird time in PC ports, but certainly at that time, it was quite common for the Xbox 360 version to get enhancements that the PC version wouldn't get, because the PC version was based on kind of the last generation version. And it's a very odd situation to be in, but I guess we are in a much more cross-platform world now where I think, shipping a last generation version on PC is probably an unlikely thing to happen. But at the time, that was quite common. To be honest, I'm kind of surprised this works as well as it does. So I will say, because Xenia, again, is not it's not as mature as our PCS3, you have got minimal settings to play with. But in terms of actually just plugging the game in and going, it runs surprisingly well. I think the biggest kind of graphical issue I had was going in to the island for the first time. You can see kind of a bunch of corruption of, I guess, the reflection data on the water. That would be my guess. Kind of not rendering properly. But outside of that, it's running pretty well, and it's kind of sticking to 30 FPS as well. It doesn't support 60 out of the box, so it is kind of capped at 30. But from a graphical perspective, it looks a whole lot different. There's a lot more effects going on. The motion blur's nice. The resolution's higher. You can tell some work really went into the Xbox 360 version. And although if you look at the CPU and GPU, you're using a lot more resources to play it this way, I actually think this would probably be my preferred way to play this. I do think there's probably time that, there's progress to be made on Xenia. That's for sure. It's still a fairly early emulator. It's not quite as stable as some of the others. But if you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of stability or, graphical... I mean, every version of the game we've looked at so far has had some sort of graphical issue. I think this might be the way to go. And I'm surprised. I was expecting to kind of boot the 360 version up, have it not render at all or crash halfway through and just fail to play. But as it turned out, it's playable. And I don't know how long your battery would last, but I found it interesting that you could even play it. So that is certainly an option. The other thing I will say is that I played this version for the longest out of the 3 that I tried. So take that for what it's worth. I think if I was going to play Just Cause 1 again, I think I'd give this a go. And the backup is always the PC version, but this seemed like a viable way to play the game, which I was very surprised by. So next up, we've got Just Cause 2. So this game came out, 4 years after Just Cause 1. Different platforms, so we're now talking PS3, 360 era with a PC version. The PC version of Just Cause 2, really good. And it was good at the time. It was probably the preferred way to play, to be honest, because PCs at the time could play these games at 60 frames per second. You have much more definition of the graphics. You'd have, much more room in the CPU for kind of the physics. And because Just Cause is kind of a game built around physics and explosions, that does benefit. The one weird thing with the PC version of Just Cause 2 is that it does take a little bit of fiddling to get working. Part of this is installing I think it's the D3D compiler that I ended up having to kind of install using Proton tricks. Once you do that, you should be able to launch the game. It took me a lot of attempts. And the one thing I ended up starting to do was trying to install Proton GE, a Glorious Egg Roll, I believe is the variant of it, which has got some kind of fixes and things in place. I sat for I want to say 35 minutes tinkering with this. I ended up at some point deleting the whole game and re-downloading it. Once I did that, it kind of came to life. What we're looking at here is the game running at, I think, 1080p was the initial attempt. From a resolution point of view, you can see, I think I ran the benchmark to start with, and it runs pretty good. I think right near the end there's a big explosion which kind of starts to tax the frames per second, but other than that, pretty stable, pretty good. The settings relatively decent, certainly not max settings, but not far. So yeah, so in terms of the actual game, runs at 60 frames per second pretty happily. It's got native Xbox 360 controller support, so you don't have to worry about mapping controls. It runs nicely. It's very hard to say. Like, it, you know, look at the GPU and CPU. We're not really taxing those particularly much, so you're going to get plenty of battery life, and you're not going to get too much stutter, I wouldn't have thought. The big thing with this game is just actually getting it running in the first place. Once you've got it up and running, it seems pretty stable. I played a good chunk of this game for 20-30 minutes. Let's not say a good chunk. that's grossly overstating it. It was pretty stable. Couldn't really complain about it. It was easily playable, and I think even plugged into a TV, you wouldn't have any problems playing this at 1080p. I did then, just out of curiosity, I wanted to try and compare it with a console version. And so I picked the PS3 version because having just said about what I said about Xenia, I thought our PCS3 is probably our best bet. Unfortunately, I don't think the Steam Deck is quite up to the task. And part of it is just the sheer amount of shader compilation that's going on. What you'll see when we actually get into game is it's all over the place in terms of frame time, and part of that I think is the shader compilation in the background. I do wonder whether the further into the game you got, maybe the more stable it would get, but it was hard to play. And I guess the other thing is the PS3 version will never be as good as the native PC version. When you've got a good PC version, there's very little reason to go looking for console versions, especially when you've got to emulate a machine that's quite demanding on hardware. So, you know, the PC version already sorts, you know, higher resolutions, higher frame rates. So there isn't really a whole lot of reason to grab the PS3 version. But it was an interesting thing to have a look at, probably just a step too far for the Steam Deck. Then brings us on to Just Cause 3, which this is the part where I thought we would get an interesting result, because Just Cause 3, again, we move up another platform. So we are talking PS4, Xbox One, PC. The console versions at the time were notorious for bad performance, partly because there was a lot of CPU dependence for physics, and yeah, the performance of that, not great. I believe, if I remember correctly, and I don't have a source on this, but I remember hearing that a lot of the problem with Just Cause 3 was that it relied upon a lot of single-threaded or single-core performance. So the fact that the PS4 and Xbox One were highly multi-core but very low clock CPUs did then make an impact and meant that the physics simulation would be quite tricky. Having said all that, the PC version, probably fine. So I jumped in, and once again, I started with 720p, which is roughly the right resolution for the screen. And first impressions out of the gate, it's pretty good. I didn't have it capped at any point, so I was just letting the frame rate go where it wanted to go. And yes, it hit 60 frames per second, but realistically, you're sort of in the 40 to 55 range. And I guarantee that would probably drop further if you got into real havoc. But ultimately, you're in the territory where your variable refresh rate stuff will smooth that out. So playable within those sorts of boundaries. You could also turn on a 30 FPS cap and probably have a great time, because you've got plenty of headroom to deal with that. The other thing you could do, I suppose, is, and I didn't record that for this because it's quite hard to capture 40 FPS, but you could do a 40 FPS cap on the Steam Deck, because the screen would support running at 40 Hz rather than running at 60, and that, again, probably a better way to run it. I did also then try to run the game at 1080, which I thought this will be an interesting test. And again, I was kind of surprised initially at the performance. It was pretty decent. It was above 30 FPS. However, once we actually get into gameplay and start driving around or exploding, we start getting a fair amount of stutter. And I tweaked kind of settings. I tried to kind of play around with it, get it to a point where it was a bit more stable, and I never quite got there. You definitely can get yourself into situations if you start turning the settings up that you're just tanking performance. Basically, I feel like if you were going to play this at 1080p on a TV, I think your performance would probably be very similar to what the PS4 and Xbox One were delivering at the time, with probably slightly less good visuals. So yeah, I'm not convinced it's a good kind of 1080 game, but at 720 it certainly seems playable, and I think there's a novelty to me having a game of that size running on a device this small that I find quite interesting. Whether you'd want to play all of Just Cause 3 on a Steam Deck, I don't know, but the option is there. It seems doable. Which leads us to the last one, which is Just Cause 4. Now this one, same platforms again, but we're in 2018, so we're kind of at the tail end of the... I say the tail end, they're still making PS4 games, but towards the end of the generation, so it's pretty demanding. I think the one thing they did with Just Cause 4 was that they tuned the engine to better support the multi-core CPUs in the kind of PS4, Xbox One. They will have had at that point probably PS4 Pro and Xbox One X, so they will have had more power to play with on those consoles. But certainly I remember hearing that Just Cause 4 from a performance perspective was better. When it comes to the Steam Deck, however, this is definitely the one that is the hardest to run. I initially was trying to get it running at 720 60. That was kind of my goal, and I think you would have to compromise a fair amount to get it to that level. Most of the settings that I tried were still leaving me down in the 40s or even the 30s, just as you were traversing the kind of island. A 30 FPS cap seemed to work pretty well, so you could get to a point where it was stable and playable, but it's not a particularly good performer. And as you can see from the stats in the corner of the screen, majority of that is the GPU. It's hammering that GPU in the Steam Deck. Out of interest, really, I then tried to run Just Cause 4 at 1080p because I was curious if we were at sort of 40 to 50, being generous on the 720 setting. I wanted to see whether it could do 1080-30. And, I mean, not really is the answer to that question. You can get close. So I played around with a number of settings. I think I dropped most of the settings to low. I also, out of curiosity, tried to drop the resolution way below 720 just to see if you could get to a point where it would run at 60. And to be honest, you have to go so low. I think, was it 320 by 200 that I tried? So low that you can't read the text, because also it scales the entire game, not just the rendering of the game. So all the text is tiny and blurry. You can get to 60 frames per second, but it's unstable. And to be honest, I don't think you're going to get what you want out of Just Cause 4 playing it at 320 by 200. So I think realistically, if you're going to play this on a Steam Deck, you're probably limited to 720, 30. Potentially with mods and with kind of, stripping it right back, you might get to 60. You might even be able to get to 40, and that might, your VRR window might be able to kind of cover over the fact that it doesn't quite hit 60. But I think being realistic about it, that's probably what to expect. The one thing I will say is that as much as I had interesting challenges getting Just Cause 1 and 2 running on the Steam Deck, 3 and 4 worked out of the box. I literally just downloaded them, hit go, worked first time. So yeah, slightly more modern games, easier to get up and running, but certainly in terms of running them on Proton, doesn't seem to be much of a problem at all. That's Just Cause. I found this kind of interesting, and it took a little while to put this together because there's multiple different versions of multiple different games. The Just Cause 3 and 4, you haven't really got a lot of choice because there is no viable way to emulate PS4 or Xbox One at this point, certainly not for games of this kind of, if you want to emulate Sonic Mania, maybe, but certainly you're not emulating Just Cause 3 from a PS4 on a Steam Deck, that's for sure. So yeah, Just Cause 1 and 2, probably the more interesting ones. And to be honest, I think outside of the 360 version of Just Cause 1, the PC versions of Just Cause are pretty good. I do think, 2's a little bit tricky to get up and running, or it can be a little bit fiddly, but ultimately, once you do get it up and running, it runs like a dream. Supports controller out the box. It's probably the game that I think most people champion as the kind of the highlight of that series. And I know there's always potential that there'll be a Just Cause 5, but at the minute we've got these 4, and I think realistically you could play all 4 of these on a Steam Deck. For me, I think the first 2 are great fits. And I think 3 would be decent. 4, I don't know whether you lose a little bit of the experience playing 4 on a Steam Deck, but then again, if you want to play something portable, then that's your only option. But that's it. That's Just Cause. And yeah, I will continue doing these as and when I can, but they are kind of fun ways to revisit franchises that I've not had a chance to play, and that's that. We will come back with another game at some point in the future.